Good evening, everyone. My name is John Tiggs, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that McNally Robinson is located here in Treaty 1 territory. That's the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We are gathered here tonight with many thanks to literary Wanderlust to celebrate the launch of Craig Terlson's new novel, Samurai Bluegrass. And you all may applaud. We're so pleased you could join us here this evening. Craig's last launch was virtual, so having warm bodies around to listen to his words and celebrate his work is quite wonderful. And we're just happy to see you all here, both in present and virtually as well. So just to let you briefly know how the evening is going to play out, there'll be an introduction up here and then a reading from Craig. That'll be followed by a conversation that will take place on these chairs to my left. Following that, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions. So if you do have a question and you're physically here, please just put up your hand and I'll rush over to you with a microphone, which is not a comment on your ability to project. It just ensures that everybody watching at home can hear your question. If you are one of those people watching at home, please feel free to write any question you might have in the chat, and we will put them to Craig as time permits. If you have any pleasant or supportive comments as well, feel free to write those in and we'll pass them along to the author at the end of the evening. At the end of the night, I will return just to go over signing procedure. The only thing I'll put in your brains right now is that we'll ask you to remain in place for one moment while we safely transport Craig to the signing table so he can steel himself for your onslaught. But now I have the enormous pleasure of welcoming up somebody else to speak a little bit about Craig's new novel and about Craig himself. That, of course, is our good friend Ben Sigurdson, the literary editor, drinks columnist, and writer in the Arts and Life department at the Winnipeg Free Press. I'm going to make you applaud for him twice. In 2005, Ben graduated from the University of Manitoba with an MA in English. He has served as a juror for regional and national book prizes, including most recently for the 2022 Kobzar Book Award and the Manitoba Book Awards 2023 McNally Robinson Book of the Year Award. Please join me in welcoming Ben Sigurdson.
Thanks. Two little bits of applause. That's pretty good. I'm two and 1/8, we'll say. I'm super pleased to be here to help Craig launch his book. It's called The African Samurai. I thought it was funny on the way in. I saw that this book, and then I was like, oh, the guy's name is Craig as well. So that was a poor visual gag for those of you at home. Just it's signed already, actually. I might have to pick this up. Anyway, I do have some notes here. It's been a while since I've done an in-person thing. I mean, Craig's been a great friend of mine since we first met in person about 15 minutes ago. Pause for laughter. No, I had the pleasure of hosting. I first encountered Craig on the website, formerly known as Twitter, where he's a prolific tweeter or whatever, poster of thoughts, formerly known as tweets. I've always found his musings about all things writing, editing, and publishing to be insightful and fascinating. And in fact, earlier this year, I brought him on board to start reviewing books for the Free Press, and he's been doing a great job at that. So for those who don't know, Craig graduated from the Alberta College of Art and Design in I actually couldn't find the year, but I thought it would be funnier to grumble. And moved to Toronto, where his work as an illustrator garnered publication and awards in a number of newspapers and magazines. And as anyone who's already read Samurai Bluegrass will know, that experience has clearly seeped into his writing a little bit. And speaking of his writing, it was in the late 90s, Craig caught a virus for which there is no vaccine, the dreaded writing bug. He started working on both short and novel-length fiction shortly thereafter. And in addition to getting some of his stories and other work in some publications, he's written a collection of short fiction and 6 novels. 6 novels, is that right? Including the one that's forthcoming. 3 of which feature hard-boiled crime solver Luke Fisher. He's twice been nominated for Manitoba Book Awards, in 2017 for Fall in One Day, and again in 2021 for Menastique, the second of Craig's 3 Luke Fisher novels, which I had the pleasure of helping him launch in 2021, albeit virtually. And the 3rd book in that series, 3-Minute Hero, is coming soon. So if anyone has any burning desires to know more about that series and when the next book is coming out, we've got Craig on hand. But for his new novel, Craig traded Fisher's trademark Pacificos and Peanuts for tea and toast in Toronto. Samurai Bluegrass chronicles the exploits of a 12th century samurai who awakens in a ravine in the body of one Gordo Clement in the Big Smoke in the 80s. Suitably confused, as any of us would be, Gordo has see, I typed this word out, I don't know how to say it. He has a moment of epiphany at a bluegrass concert, thwarts some thugs after the show with his samurai skills, befriends a single mom, is chased around town by a man claiming to be a doctor, who's in fact another samurai, clambers down numerous fire escapes and races against time to try and find out how to cross over and get back home. You know, that same old story you've heard before. Anyway, there's much more to Samurai Bluegrass, but I'll leave it to Craig to get into during our chat. The book is meditative, it's funny, it's heartbreaking, has some killer fight scenes, and so much more. It was a delight to read, and I'm delighted to be here. And if you've not yet gotten to know Gordo Clement, you'll be pleased to make his acquaintance in this book. And if you've not heard Craig read or talk about his book or his work before, well, you're in for a treat, and that's about to change right now. Craig.
I was aware of that book. It's lovely to see you all here. Just to say a moment about, I just ran into Ben outside in the parking lot and he agreed to host. So I think that's awesome. But no, it's like, when you said the premise, I didn't realize that I wrote a weird book. Just to me, this is just how it fell out of my brain. But the reviews, which have been really, really lovely, talk about the unusual premise and even some Latin sui generis, which I had to look up, this unique, different thing. And I said, well, that's just kind of how the story went. So I'm just gonna do a short reading. I like to read from the beginning because it doesn't need much setup. And you'll hear a bit of Gordo's voice. And you'll hear the other main character, whose name is Heather. She's a single mom trying to be an illustrator. And then there's a very small little piece on music, because there's a lot of music in this book. So we'll start right at chapter 1. Toronto, 1984. Every day I remained in the city, I thought of my death. I rose with the sun on this bright May morning, drank my green tea, and left my apartment. Yet, all the while, my death walked with me. Walking over the cracks and lines of the sidewalk, I passed faded buildings that had long since lost their sheen, and then into the small park I visited every day. Death was always with me. The trees and lush grass were a comfort. I breathed in their scent. A young boy kicked a red ball and then stopped to look at me, searching my pale face for the shortest of moments. Perhaps he knew that this was not the skin I was born with. My death happened far away from the city I had now inhabited for 3 years. Thoughts of that true home were woven together with a deep longing that traveled with me, as ever present as death. So much made little sense. Yet I tried to understand my new surroundings. Why did I remain here? The desire to return home burned in me with the hottest of flames. Still, this world cared not for my aching soul. No one did. I began all my mornings in the city by walking through the park, which led me to Queen Street and then to the Pearl. This eating establishment was owned by Mr. Stan, who served people in a long, narrow room with tall back benches and tables made out of something that looked like wood, but was not. People from all classes came in search of a hot drink and for the sun that poured in the large window by the entrance. Mr. Stan allowed all people to stay as long as they wanted. The heat wafting from my steeping tea moistened my face. Small beads of sweat broke across my forehead. Even in this new life, surrounded by the citizens of a strange city, my death lingered at the edges of every hour. I was told by my teacher to respect this awareness of death, that it would bring vibrance to my daily life. The death I'd experienced was not the kind my teacher spoke of, but there was no way to ask him now. Gordo, you're gonna drink that? Just taking my time, Mr. Stan. You're never in a hurry to go anywhere, are you, Gordo? What will I do when I arrive? Good point. You don't need to keep calling me Mister. I used to call you Master, I said, which made Mr. Stan laugh. This was a conversation we'd had many times. He turns back to me and cracked eggs over his hot metal plate. The eating establishment, what the patrons called a diner, smelled of fried meat, sweat, and smoke. Since arriving in the city, I visited the Pearl for 2 of the last 3 years, though to say arrive meant that I understood how I came to be here. I did not. I could count the exact days and even hours I had spent in the city. I was taught to be aware, ever aware of the passing of time, how it moved in the smallest of moments, as well as in its sweeping waves. My awareness of time was not a regret. I understood that time was a river we swam in, its water forever spilling into unknown territory. It had no end. Stan didn't know who I was or where I once lived. No one did. I tried to tell Harry, but he was not capable of understanding. When Harry warned me of a place he called the Crazy House, I decided it would not be wise to inform people of my true home. There were authorities in the city who could be called upon at any time to take a person to such a place. The part of the river I now swam in was unfathomably far away from where my life began, where I grew as a child, where I was trained until my banishment. Hey, Gordo, you want some toast with your English? I'm fine, thank you, Stan. Stan flipped eggs onto a dish, then placed strips of meat on either side, ending with a scoop of potatoes the color of sand and a circle of pink tomato. I observed Stan often, marveling at his skill and the discipline he had mastered. Once a week, I allowed myself the indulgence of a Stan breakfast. It was all my funds allowed. See yourself, I can cook you an egg if you need some this morning. Thanks, Mr. Stan. Sorry, Stan, I'm really fine. Stan believed I had no money, or very little. He was somewhat correct, although I was much better off than when I arrived. With the help of my guides, Harry and then Joshua, I had learned to survive in a place that required currency. I worked as a painter now, not on canvases or paper, but in rooms and sometimes entire buildings. The money I earned helped pay for my rent, my food, my morning tea at the Pearl. My needs were simple. Gordo was the name given to me by a man named Harry, who became my first guide. The name I gave to officials, Gordon, was no more my name than this shortened version. I preferred the sound of Gordo as it felt closer to my true identity. Joshua, the guide who came after Harry, told me that Stan had named his diner after his wife, who was dead. I understood this kind of honor. The tea from the Pearl tasted better than where I was before. Not in the time before, but at the shelter where I first met Harry. The tea in the city tasted nothing like what I was used to, and it was empty of all ceremony. Some put a sweet white powder in it, which made it worse. Joshua put the powder in his coffee, a beverage I'd not heard of until my arrival. Everyone here drank coffee much more than tea. Joshua told me the city ran on it. Stan took me in as he did anyone who came off the street. For him, this was simply an exchange of funds for food and beverage. There was no offer of a bed or shelter of any kind, beyond the time I spent sipping tea and eating bread. But Stan welcomed me as if to his home, even if he didn't know my real name or my true home. And now we switch to Heather. Heather knew it was all about the spring in the brush, the way it responded to the paper, filling the depressions of the cold press, the paint flowing across the surface at the exact rate she wanted. It was control, but more than that, it was finding the confidence to let the brush be an extension of her hand. The Cure blasted from a small stereo in her studio. She'd packed it in the car with all her worldly belongings when she drove to Toronto, a place she always knew she'd end up. Saying goodbye to her father was the hardest part. He had done so much for her these last years. Not since her mother died had she seen such tears on his face. Her studio was the open space between the kitchen, the living room, and an apartment. And the plan was to make enough money as an illustrator to be able to rent some studio space in a warehouse. She thought she could afford something in the fashion district, especially if she shared it with another artist. After she booted Michael out, she had moved from Etobicoke and into the 2-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a duplex. Her new neighborhood, a few blocks down from college, west of Bathurst, made her feel like she was actually living in the city now. From the beginning, moving to Toronto was a huge risk, but she was ready for it. Michael had found a small house in Etobicoke with 2 bedrooms, so Zach, that's her son, could have his own room. And it had the bonus of a cubby room that fit her drawing table perfectly. Michael was great with Zach and was supportive of her goal of becoming an illustrator, even if he didn't fully understand it. Her father never understood either. "I'd expect to make money," her father said, sitting across from him, her in her smoky kitchen. "Magazines pay artists to illustrate articles. So do book companies, advertising agencies, newspapers even," she said. "Why not just have someone working for the magazine draw the pictures?" It doesn't work that way. They're looking for freelancers. That's how they put the magazine together. "You'll get enough rent for this? Toronto rent? It's a lot more there, you know. I wish I could help you, but now that I'm forced to retire because the garage is shut down, who is?" "I'll make it work, Dad." She stopped him from continuing the story she'd heard from him daily since she'd finished art school in Calgary. He crossed the room and gave her a hug. "What about Zach? Can you make enough for him too? Why don't you stay a few more months here or even a year?" She sucked in a long breath. She hugged her father back and whispered in his ear, "Trust me, okay? I'm strong, just like you." And then just a really brief thing. I had a bookmark that I took out. I'm showing these because you can have these later if you want. I brought some. So as mentioned, there's a lot of bluegrass music. There's a lot of all kinds of music in this. So this just gives you just a little touch of the music. Gordo is at a club called the Apocalypse Club, full of goth and punk people. He's with a woman named Rain. 2 women had pieces of metal in their white skin. I had seen this adornment before. One appeared to have a large pin sticking through her cheek, clasped into a round latch. I had distant memory of others piercing their skin like this, yet I couldn't bring it forward in my mind. I was about to risk asking Rain if she could explain this sort of skin decoration when the white lights on the platform went out. The crowd murmured as the lights glowed back to life, changing the people to the color of the sea. Again, I wanted to ask a question, but I was stopped short by the sound of strings vibrating. A group of 4 emerged from the darkness to stand at the platform. The light not strong enough to expose them in full clarity. A hand moved quickly back and forth, the source of the string vibration. A voice cried out like someone calling from an impossibly long tunnel, trying to say something vital. It was a sad voice, but also beautiful. A sound that came from deep within a soul. The words were not words, just long vowel sounds. And then another voice joined, and another. The sound expanding like sun breaking through the clouds. Words were formed, but the meaning was unimportant, as this was about the sound. The voices and strings wove together. The vibrations entered me and moved through my chest. The vibrations took me back to my last ride in the forest. The sounds were similar, but the place different. Rain stared, her mouth slightly open. I gazed around the room. The light fell on the glowing faces of a crowd transfixed by the men in bright white clothes and tilted hats. Their music filled the room, and as if by magic, the walls changed color. Was it a trick of the light or perhaps a spell this group of men had cast upon us all? The men in white possessed a power over this crowd. Had these young faces ever seen something like this? I turned my full attention to the men in hats, trying to understand what we were experiencing. These men were only musicians, and yet together they created something mystical. I barely noticed when Joshua returned with our fermented beverages. Hi.
Oh, okay, hot mic, we're on.
We're on.
That was great, and I love that passage with the bluegrass band. It's so interesting to hear you read it, and to think back on it. And the first time I read it, I was quite moved by it. But it's so interesting because you don't really get a sense of what it sounds. I mean, we know what bluegrass music sounds like, but there's never much description of, you know, like the instruments or even trying or Gordo even trying to sort of comprehend what it sounds like or whatever. It's so much, it's just a feeling that he has, which is so fascinating. Well done. That wasn't really a question, I guess. Well, why don't we start with talk a bit about the origin. No, that's embarrassing.
You're professional, right?
That's my first question. Thank you, John. Talk a bit about the origins of this story. Like, when did you? What was the first thing that sort of popped into your head in relation to this story, and
yeah,
you know, where did it go from there?
The thing about, like, books take me a long time. I'm usually working on more than one at one time, but I know I tracked this book to around 8 or 9 years that I worked on it, and the impetus really began a night in the Apocalypse Club on College Avenue, where I watched Bill Monroe, the father of bluegrass music, play at a punk club with a bunch of goths. I don't know who booked him there. He was either brilliant or stupid,
yeah.
But the goths and the punkers and all that love these guys. And these guys were dressed in shiny white Nashville stuff. The nights never left me.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I've always been a huge lover of Japanese film, notably Kurosawa's work. And I wrote a short story, which was published in a magazine called Carve. The short story was called Samurai Bluegrass. I thought I could steal from my own work and call the novel Samurai Bluegrass as well. Mm-hmm. The story is not quite this book, but I was mesmerized by these people playing music, and they didn't care where they were. They were playing with such honor and beauty, and I've never forgot it. Yeah.
Amazing. And so over the course of 8 or 9 years, you just sort of worked on it here and there, and obviously you've had lots of other books come out in that time as well.
I think I got to a place of about 20 or 25,000 words, and then I didn't really know what else to do with it. And I set it aside. And I didn't know really that it was going to be a Toronto book, because I haven't written any Toronto books. This is my first Toronto book. And I was in Toronto in the 80s. And I think I needed that distance from it. So I think I put it away, and I was working on the Luke Fisher stuff and all of that. And then when I brought it back, I also knew that, oh, this is going to take a lot of research. Mm-hmm. This is going to take a stack of books, and it did.
Yeah, no, that was one thing I wanted to ask you about too, is the research. I mean, with the Luke Fisher books, you know, you've got to learn how to. I was reading a little bit about your writing. I was reading a bit of your writing on Substack about research and stuff, and kind of learning about guns and stuff like that in terms of Luke Fisher stuff. But this, I imagine, would have taken it to an entirely different level. I mean, do you enjoy that kind of stuff? You wrote a little bit about how you can sort of get bogged down and lost by that, or, you know, it sort of overtakes you or whatever.
It does. I mean, I actually love research. The hardest thing about research is that you love it so much and you realize there's a scene in the book that I know is like about less than a paragraph that I read the book. I read a whole book. It was called The Book of the Five Rings. You have to put it all away. But I just felt to be real. I can't imagine what it's like to be like a 12th century samurai, but this is a history we don't know about. Mm-hmm. And we're not, I learned, like everyone, I learned lots of Canadian history, like every year, you know, but you don't learn about all the Japanese periods. And so, yes, I got lost in it. And I read so many books, and I wanted to give a shout out to the Samurai Archives podcast, which has about 100 episodes, and I've listened to them all repeatedly.
Oh, wow.
So it gets a little bit, and what I like is when people tell me they feel the research, because you can get bogged down. The reader can get bogged down too.
Yeah, but I mean, I did feel the research, but I never felt it got bogged. Like it felt very natural, and I think maybe that has to do with voice as well, which maybe we'll get. We can talk about it now. I noticed even in the two passages that you read, or the first two passages, you know, the one from Gordo's perspective and the one sort of the third person perspective on Heather, you read them like in a different tone, in a different speed. Like the Gordo passage, I found it seemed like you were reading a little bit more slow and methodical versus the Heather passage, which was a little bit more upbeat, sort of. And I feel like those voices, like that, I feel like that's the way I read the book as well. Is when, you know, when Gordo's internal monologue is happening, or internal narrative. It's just the way he speaks, the way he thinks is so much more methodical. What was that? What was it like? You're great with dialogue. I mean, I know that from the when we launched Mastique, and reading this book as well. It's just reinforced. But
thank you.
What was it like to create those voices, particularly, I guess, Gordo, who is such a different voice than the rest of the characters?
It took a long time. I mean, voice takes a long time. I'm lucky that I have a good ear for dialogue. I work on it a lot.
Are you an eavesdropper?
I'm not. People say that. Well, I am, but I never write anything down. You know? So I don't know why. I like the cadence of speech a lot, probably because I talk a lot, you know, and I love the cadence of speech. And I love, like, I'm supposed to give a shout out to my daughter because she's over there, right? So we did 3 plays together, and having your words said out loud by actors is both terrifying and you learn a lot, kind of thing. And so cadence is very important. It took quite a while to find Gordo's voice, like maybe a few years to find it. And then the more that I understood Gordo, the more that I understood how crazy, to use that word, you know, how just surreal would it be to jump ahead, whatever it is, 900 years, and everything has to be, and that was actually interesting, that in his voice to kind of go, everything has to be so brand new that you almost lose your mind. And so then that methodical nature started to come through.
Yeah, I mean, he essentially, almost everything, unless he's sort of encountered it already in the last few years that he's been in Toronto in the 80s in Gordo's body, everything is new. Everything is, you know, it doesn't understand a lot of the sort of colloquialisms and those kind of things. So I thought that was extremely well done. It was just and it made for some very heartfelt and also very funny moments, I think, in the book as well, like with interactions with people who just sort of take these things for granted and stuff. How else is I gonna? I mean, do you do a lot of reading other than the research and stuff? Do you do a lot of reading while you're writing, and does it change sort of like you're doing the Luke Fisher books, you're doing this book, whatever?
I read constantly, and I read like across the genres. I'm a big fan of literary fiction. I read like all the literary stuff, all the classic stuff. I always say, I don't want to go into Luke Fisher much, but I fell into crime fiction accidentally. I never wrote crime fiction kind of thing. And someone said, well, you know, you kind of sound like Joe Lansdale, the Texas writer, and I don't know what was Joe Lansdale. And so that was the whole thing. So, but I've always read widely, and some writers are afraid to read while you're writing, but I never am. Like, I mean, I guess I wasn't reading any samurai novels, you know. So, because but I don't feel like, even if I'm affected by it, I think it's going to come through my lens anyway. So yeah, I read all the time.
Well, I think reading, doing the research on the period and what have you, and not reading samurai novels probably helped establish your voice versus, you know, just falling into the genre and sort of, you know.
Yeah, like what I did read, some of these things I read Japanese short stories, including the short stories that Kurosawa created Rashomon from, and the Japanese short stories have a very different cadence to them. I love them. I fell in love with them. They're not North American stories. And I also listen to music a lot when I write, and I listen to a lot of Japanese folk music. Right.
So that was one of the questions I was going to ask you, is because music does play a role in this book and in your other books as well. Yeah. And I know that you're a big music buff and or fan or whatever. You have some similar tastes.
Totally. Wilco.
Yeah,
Let's just talk about Wilco.
Yeah, sure. They have a new album coming out next.
I know.
This one is called Cousin. Sure. Can we spin it? No. But yeah. So does it? So I lost my train of thought. Now we're talking about. Oh, we were talking about music and listening to music, listening to music. So that's something you do just on a regular basis. You change a little bit. So you said you were sort of listening to some more Japanese folk music, but
during first drafts, I mean, this is the thing too. I usually almost always, when I'm editing, is in the silence. First drafts, I really like music. So I would put on a lot of 80s music, which, you know, I don't like that much. There's some that I like, but I wanted that feel of the 80s kind of stuff, and Japanese music. And when I say Japanese music, it's like, you know, what I think of these folk music with the flutes, the pan flutes, and like that. And that helped, you know. But then when it's time to edit, mostly I shut everything off.
Okay. Yeah. And I mean, I also know you're a movie buff, and you talk about Kurosawa. When you're writing a book like this, are you framing it in? Are you like framing it? Frame like in your mind. Are you sort of like seeing the way it's sort of the scene is set? Or?
That's such a great question, because people ask me that sometimes, because my background's an illustrator. Do I see things really visually? And I don't really think like film that way. I let it almost more by osmosis. I mean, I love not just Kurosawa, but I soak up Japanese film again because it's so different and it's so beautiful. And I think that somehow, I'll say it this way. People have said sometimes, hey, this book is kind of like Kurosawa's Seven Samurai. I said, no, it's not really. It really isn't. I get it. But then someone said to me, this is like Ghost Dog, but Jim Jarmusch. And I went, oh yeah, it is. Right? Do you know Jarmusch's kind of thing, right? You know,
I do, yeah. I don't.
And he did Ghost Dog with Forrest Whitaker, with a coat of the Bushido on there and the samurai and stuff like that. And I never even thought of that.
Yeah. And
so I think film by osmosis creeps into a lot of what I do. Because I study film, I love film, but it's a book, not a film. So it's separated in my head somehow.
Well, okay, and so sort of sneaking into the book, I'm hesitant to talk too much about particular characters and stuff like that, just because I don't know how many people here have read it. Oh, sorry, I forgot to put my hand. Okay. One of the character traits of Heather's that I found interesting was the fact that she is an illustrator for magazines and advertising agencies and stuff like that, which I know your background is as well. Did you just sort of see this as a good opportunity to sort of like to sort of write through your experience, or did it just sort of, you know, you were sort of like, okay, well, I've got Heather, what's Heather going to do? And it's like, well, she's going to be an illustrator.
Yeah, that one kind of, again, I worked on this book for so long, it's hard to remember kind of thing. But I think that where Heather started for me was, again, the idea of home. Because I think that's a parallel with the characters that start to creep up for me, is Gordo was away from home and Heather was away from home. And Gordo, on purpose, is from the 12th century, the Heian period, which is a lot about art. And so there are these parallels kind of thing. And Heather is not based on me. Heather's based on some of my experience and a bunch of illustrators that I knew. But I wanted a couple things. I wanted her to have that longing and also that responsibility of taking care of a child. But I also wanted her to, put it this way, I wanted her to get the art right. And this is the thing, because when an illustrator reads a book and they say something, they go, well, that would never happen. So if you're reading this thing and you read about the Winsor Newton Klensky Sable 7 brush, which my editor wanted me to take out, I said, no, I'm leaving it in there because that's what I use. And if there's like 20 illustrators that went, oh, Winsor Newton, oh. You know, I was like, yes. So I wanted to get the art right, because lots of times books don't.
Well, and I thought the scenes that you wrote that depict her drawing and illustrating, or like the way you describe her brush strokes and stuff, it's very like it's got this movement that I thought of, you know, in a similar way as even when Gordo is, you know, sort of getting into tussles here and there. It's never like a slugfest or whatever. It's always like very sort of. There's a movement and almost like a ballet-like quality to it of I don't know why I'm doing this. It's weird.
Well, it's awesome, and you know that you point that out, because a few other reviewers have pointed it out. And again, it wasn't really intentional. And then I'm starting to see stuff and I go, yes, what she is doing is like a dance, and what he's doing is like a dance. And that's again why I had to do so much research, where I read all this stuff on what is he studying, what is the code of the Bushido.
Okay. I mean, oh, hang on, talk about the dollar. I'm intrigued by the Doctor. I don't want to, sort of get too into his character, but you have written crime novels, some of which, I would assume feature, like the bad guy or whatever. But this guy is like a real bad dude.
He was super bad.
Yeah.
Super bad.
Was that and he's been there a little bit longer, and so he's picked up on some of the colloquialisms of 1984, and therefore sounds a lot more like the people around him, but with a real nasty edge. Did you enjoy writing his character? Well, it's a chance to throw in some swears and stuff.
Well, like I have a really hard time creating bad villain people. Like even in my crime fiction, I know there's bad people, but they always have kind of like that, And when the Doctor, and I struggle to call him something, and then I realize it's even more badass to just call him the Doctor. And that's all I'm going to call him, not even going to give him a name. And as I wrote him and he became nastier and darker, a friend of mine pointed out that he's like Prometheus in the sense that he wants to go back to his people and bring this stuff, bring the knowledge of the 20th century back and rule. And I was like, wow, you're really bad. and you sometimes, if you develop characters or gifts, if you develop good characters, they're just going to talk to you. And the Doctor would just talk to me, and I'm kind of scared of him, and I don't want to give away anything either, but he's, I think for me, the first really, really bad guy I've made.
Yeah,
because he's bad.
But it was fun. You enjoyed it. You write another guy?
I did enjoy it.
Yeah.
I like the darkness. I like going into the darkness. Definitely.
That's great. Another character I wanted to ask you about, who doesn't play a lengthy role in this book, but I found so fascinating, and I don't think there's any sort of spoilerish content in talking about her, is Vera, or Vimbo. Fascinating character who meets Gordo at a time where he just needs to meet her and offer some real insight into his life. What was it? Can you talk a little bit about that character without giving too much away?
Definitely. Her name is Vera. Her Shonen name, which I learned from a close friend of ours who's Zimbabwe, her true name is Vimbo, and that you get a couple of names when you grew up in that country. And she came much later in the development of the book, and I think I was starting to see parallels of home. Again, she's very displaced, and she is displaced in the sense that, and the research I did for that was my friendship with her and have these conversations. And she grew up at a time of a dictatorship, and just horrible things were happening, and she was in this world in the same way that Gordo was in this world. These are new places, and a couple of people have pointed out it's kind of an immigrant experience or something like that. But I grew very, let me put it this way. Yes, she's based on a real person, I told her, but she's not. Because anyway, whenever you start with a real person, they become someone else, right? And so she became Vera, right? And I hold that character very dear. And so when people, thank you for mentioning her, when she comes out as a real person, I go, oh, wow, that's good. I like that. Because in the book, she is real. And
she has such a, not a long time in the book, but such an important time in Gordo's development. I'll just sort of kind of leave it.
Well, Gordo is so much about longing, his desire. He's, again, one of my early readers called him the sad samurai. He's just sad. He's not always sad, but he's longing. And Vera is someone who really listens to him. And that to me is very important.
Yeah, and she seems to come with her, or bring with her, a bit more joy. Whereas, and that maybe, that doesn't exactly sort of rub off on Gordo, but probably provide some pretty
I
important.
kind of think in a way, I've never thought about the two, really 2000. I think she's teaching him something.
Mhm.
I'm not quite sure what she's teaching him, but there's something being learned there.
Yeah, I got that feeling as well. It's about what 2/3 of the way.
Yeah, she's about 2/3 into the book.
Yeah.
Not a big character, but I'm glad you pointed her out. Yeah.
Yeah, no, she was she stuck with me for sure, like a long time after I read it. Geez, I don't know. We could take some questions from the audience. You were talking about home, and longing, and you know, and even Heather goes home and sees her father and stuff like that. And there is sort of, did you feel when you lived in Toronto there's a real sort of transient characteristic to it, like in terms of people who live there, like they come from somewhere else, be it another country, another province, whatever.
Well, I'll put it this way, Ben. I mean, I thought this book was about death. And when I started it, it's cheery. You know, I finished it during the pandemic too.
Yeah.
You know, I was thinking a lot about death.
Yeah.
The first line in the book is, every day I remained in the city, I found my death. I've had that book for years. I've had that line for 10 years. And so I thought this was a book about death, but books teach you things that you have to pay attention to. And for me, everyone's gonna have a different experience with it. This book began to teach me that this is actually about home. What is home?
Mhm.
Where is home?
Mhm.
And I don't live in Toronto anymore. I have no desire to be in Toronto anymore. My wife who's here tonight was really glad we're not in Toronto anymore, you know? But it's full of a bunch of us who landed in Toronto and said, okay, is this home now? And there is a disorientation. And I think that is what kind of the book taught me about that, if that makes sense. You know?
Mhm, absolutely. Well, do we, John?
Yeah, let's take some
I thought I heard him grow up there. I knew you were hiding back.
Let's
You have
have
like
beer back.
snacks or something.
So we do have one question from online to start off. We do also have a number of positive comments. So Grumman011 says, did you imagine in your mind Gordo as Toshiro Mifune, even with the red hair?
The question about Toshiro Mifune. I love Toshiro Mifune so much that there's a Twitter hashtag Mifune Mondays, which I have kept up. I'm going to confess something. I really sometimes don't know what my characters look like. I don't. If you read my books, even my Luke Fisher books and stuff, they go, "What's Luke Fisher look like?" And I kind of go, "I'm not sure." It's up to the reader a little bit, right? So I think Toshiro Mifune is one of the not greatest Japanese actors. He's one of the greatest actors of all time, and I love Toshiro Mifune. And so Gordo has red hair, so he definitely does not look like Toshiro Mifune.
I think he looks like John.
So, you know, he does. He looks a lot like John, because for me, I wanted him to look like a real Canadian guy. John looks Canadian. And just to finish to say, I wanted to give him a real Canadian name. So what's a real Canadian name? Gordo. Hey, Gordo. Hey, Gordo, how's it going, eh? So, yeah.
That's okay.
Thank you so much. Were there any other questions in the audience?
You got him here.
I haven't read the book, but I guess the thing of home I get, but I'm also very aware for me, there's a very much a cross-cultural thing. And I was wondering if you were conscious of that, because that's, I mean, having experienced some of the cross-cultural displacement and studied it, I very quickly picked up, this is interesting cross-cultural. And I was wondering if you were aware of that when you were writing.
It's a great question. I'm aware of it as an observer. I mean, I'm Scandinavian. My grandfather is from Denmark and Norway, but I'm Canadian, right? And, but, you know, as I dip into cultures, I'll put it this way. At some point in the book, I was really worried because I will own that this Japanese culture is not mine. So I'm there as an observer. And, but I find that what I learned so much, that's one of the reasons why I did so, I'm sorry to keep repeating this, I did so much research because I wanted to feel natural within it, even though this is not my culture. And I think that there is something very, I'm going to put it, harmonious that happens in the book between the cultures. You know, I've always loved the idea that it's Canada is a melting, sorry, US is a melting pot, Canada is a mosaic, right? And I've always loved that. And I think there's a real thing about, and Toronto, oh my goodness, Toronto, a city of neighborhoods, right? So many neighborhoods. And that's why I had a studio just south of Chinatown, and I wanted to have that feel of Chinatown in the book, even though Gordo's Japanese, right? So I'm aware of the culture, and I'm deeply affected by it. Lastly, to mention, I'm aware of my friendships, like my friend, my Zimbabwe friend, about what her culture is like. And so again, it's like, as a writer, you're an observer. You're trying to just be really honest. That's my biggest thing. I just want to be honest. And some stuff I don't know, you know, so.
Yeah, for some reason, I'm thinking about the relationships in the book. It seems that they're really very challenging relationships. Like Gordo had this longing for relationships, and then sort of that disappointed and hurt, you know, same with Heather. Can you say more about those relationships? Yeah,
I think to have true relationships for me, this is as a writer again. I mean, I say, if Ben's peeked at my Substack, he knows I talk about this a lot, about the two questions I ask myself when I'm writing towards the end of a project, or any project, is why this story, and is it true? And truth is really important to me. And in relationships, there's pain. And so, of course, as a writer, you're delving into that. I've seen pain. I've seen some of my own pain. I've seen other people's pain. And so, yeah, they're tough relationships. And I want redemption to come out of them, but not fake redemption. It has to be like real, earned redemption, which can only happen as if you sit with characters a long time. It's kind of meditative, actually, to kind of go, you know, there's a thing, again, if you're listening, bless my editor, because she made me do something that was so good. In early drafts, Heather was not that strong of a character. And she said, I don't want a pity party. Heather needs to be strong. And that line that I read there came in a very last edit. I'm strong just like you, Dad. And Heather went open as soon as I did that. And you only sit in front of that blank page for so long, hoping that stuff happens. Yeah. Cool.
Hi, Craig. I haven't read your book yet, so maybe this question doesn't ring a bell, but you use the word redemption, and I know you read a lot of theology.
And I knew you were going to out me on that.
Yes. No, I'm just going to ask you.
Wait, is he your doctor?
No.
I should be. He is now.
No, I'm just saying, what role, if any, did theological themes play in the book? I'm not saying they should be there. I'm just wondering if they are there.
I'm going to theology is a loaded term. It's unfortunate because all it is about study, right? I'm going to broaden it to philosophy because I read a lot of philosophy as well. And I think that when I delved into all these, and I knew some Buddhist thought and some Tao and that, and it's just expands. Put it this way, I always know that there's more to life than this. I can't fully explain it, and I need my characters to feel that too. So as I began to know Gordo more and more, because it's not mentioned much in the book, but Gordo, I think he might make a comment at some point or something like that, but it's just a broad philosophy of creation that I lean into. It's kind of a vague answer, but it's always going to be there. It actually sneaks into the Luke Fisher books more and more. I'm trying to keep crime fiction, and the philosophy keeps coming in. Like, get out, philosophy. I'm sorry, we need more guns and beer.
Right now?
Yeah. John's got guns.
What?
He's Canadian.
Crowd control. So we have another question online. Speaking of the Luke Fisher series, will there ever be a sequel Gordo deserves and we the readers hope for?
I have a spin-off question to that as well. Or maybe it's an adjacent question. that I meant to ask you. What is it like for you to write within a series? Like, is it a comfort zone of going, okay, we're doing Luke now? Or is there more of is there something where you go outside of the series and you're like, oh, now I can stretch my legs, to even do what I want?
I think the way I'll answer that first is the language changes. I always ask people if they read the Luke Fisher and they read Samurai, does this feel like the same author? Because I think, literary is a loaded term, but there are more literary things that are happening in Samurai than with Luke. Luke is supposed to move like a locomotive, and he does. And I love writing Luke. And he's comfortable. And I've never series, this is the only series I've ever written, but this is the third book which is finished, and it does feel really good to kind of get into that gear. And when I left Samurai and went, oh yeah, let's see what Luke's doing, right? And just felt like it felt very easy. But then, like most books, it started to beat me up, and it was still hard. Gordo, I really don't know. To me, oh boy, it's a great question. You always want to say never. There's a point towards the end of the book that I'll just put out there as an Easter egg that points to a possible sequel, right? It's there. I know it's there. No one else has pointed it out. That's fine. It could, all I'll say is it could be. Definitely, Luke Fisher's going to keep going because I love that guy. And Gordo, I love him in a different way, so I don't know.
What about a crossover series?
Oh, man. Okay, I know what I'm writing tonight.
So you did mention the next Luke Fisher book. It's called 3 Minute Hero.
3 Minute Hero, yeah.
If people want to hear you read from it, they can, right? On your Substack.
Substack, I read the first chapter on Substack. Yeah.
And can you tell us when it's coming up?
Yeah, I mean, the books, it's always kind of weird. People say, oh, you're so prolific. I'm not. These just happen coincidentally. Samurai took 8 or 9 years. Luke took about 2 and change. And they just happened to do this. But Luke should be out. In fact, I said online, Luke is out October 27th. I know a lot of people know my work because of Luke, so I'm like really grateful for that. And this book, the editor said it, my early readers have said it, it's the best one. It's just the best one. And it brings back, if you've read Surf City, it brings back a really fun character named Mostly Harold. So Mostly Harold and Luke are in 3 Minute Hero, and yeah, it's a fun one. End of October. And Substack, what he mentions, if you don't know Substack, I have a thing there called Craig Terlson Writes, I think, or something like that. You can find it. And I have an audio of the first chapter being read. Yeah. Oh, he's probably got a thing there.
It's called Craig Terlson Talks Story. Just like you did tonight. Looks like John's got a question lined up there.
Oh, not at all. I was just going to ask if there was one dramatic final question before we move on to the closing comment.
If it's not dramatic, don't bother.
Yeah, no, I want just have no non-dramatic questions.
One thing I liked about the book was that each character had its own voice. And I got wondering throughout the book how does an author do that? Like, how do you keep that sort of straight? Like, do you go to the end of the book and you kind of read through, or maybe your editor does and was like, oh, Joshua would never say something like that. But like how, because Gordo sounded like somebody from far away and long ago kind of thing. And Joshua sounded like somebody from Toronto in the 80s.
Yeah. Joshua smoked a lot of dope too.
And he sounded like that, right?
Yeah.
So how does an author do that?
That's a great question. I think there's a couple of things. The first kind of like mystical author answer to that is you listen to your characters. You have to really listen. The practical one is I will do passes in the novel, which is what you call every new edit, that are just looking at the voice. So I did a Heather pass where I just looked at all the Heather passages and went, is this, and she changed a lot in editing. Gordo took me a while to find his voice, but I will do that. You're like an actor. You have to be an actor, actually. You have to embody the part and really feel, again, is it true? Would Gordo, and if you're true, the character goes, oh, no, I would never say that. I would never say that. And that's why the Doctor, yes, I did have a lot of fun writing the Doctor. And you have to go dark places and realize this person wants to hurt people. I'm a nice guy. I don't want to hurt people, but it's fun to just put on that coat.
That's great. Well, I mean, unless there are any other questions, John has disappeared again. So if there are, yeah, I guess there are a lot. But thank you so much, Craig, for having me out and to help you launch this book. It's been great talking to you about it, and I love the book too. So
Thank you so much.
That was a bonus. That's awesome.
Thank you.
It would have been terrible if I hated it.
Can I say something brief? Of course. Should I say it from here? You can say it wherever you like.
I really did want Ben to do this because Ben asked such really good questions. You can find the Manastique launch on YouTube and listen to it because it's just so much fun kind of thing. And you're just such a close reader. And I love close readers because they pay attention to things, right? Really brief thank yous that I want to just give shout outs to. Because I said I would. My publisher is down in Colorado, Literary Wanderlust. It's an amazing team led by Susan Brooks. My editor, Mandy Miller, also from Colorado, really made this a better book because she kicked my butt hard. I have early readers, Teresa Theron, I'm sure I didn't say her last name right, Teresa from Ontario, Martine Proctor from Texas by way of Belgium, Phil Krymusa from Africa, Sally Ito is here tonight. Thank you so much, Sally, for their guidance and great notes. Shout out to Mike Gray, who I know is watching. Sorry, Mike, there's no bears in this one. For Linda at Quantum, who's printed posters and bookmarks. If you want to come by the book signing table, I'd be happy to give you posters and bookmarks until I run out. Those are free. Thanks to Ben for just everything. For John is a superhero to writers. Any writers in the city, John Taves is a superhero. Okay, he supports us so much. Keep supporting independent bookstores like McNally because they're just the best, and there's not that many of them. Well, there's a surge of them coming back, and I just believe a lot in them. My family for their support, my wife especially because she knows what this takes, and for the people who take time to read my work. I almost made this. The best thing to do is engage with readers. That's my favorite thing to do as a writer.
Fire up the Wilco.
Yeah, can we?
No, thank you so very much, Craig. That's very humbling, very kind, and that was a wonderful event. So thank you, both of you. And Craig, thank you so much for sharing your insight into writing, the craft of it as well, in addition to talking about Samurai Bluegrass. We will be moving along to the signing portion of the evening. We have copies of the book at the table available for Craig to sign. We have copies at our cash desk. You can get a copy signed before you pay for it. Just please do pay for the book before you leave. With more preparation, we would have dramatically lifted Craig on board an Oromono and brought him over to the signing table, but instead tonight we will simply wander over dramatically. We would just ask that you remain in place for 1 second while we get Craig all set up, at which point I will summon you. So thank you all so very much for being here this evening, both in person and virtually. Thank you to Literary Wanderlust for putting out this book in the first place, to Ben for his insight and for all of his questions and presence, and of course, to Craig Terlson. Please join me in acknowledging him one more time.